The following is distributed by the Berean Call.
Chapter 4. What about World War III? In August 1982, major newspapers around the world carried sensational articles quoting angry denials by Defense Secretary Caspar W. Weinberger that the United States was, quote, planning a protracted nuclear war, unquote. This seemed to represent a dramatic and frightening departure from past official U.S. policy, which has always been based upon the belief that there are, quote, no winners in a nuclear war, unquote. Upset by what he termed, quote-unquote, inaccurate reporting of American intentions, Weinberger wrote a letter to 30 U.S. newspapers and 40 foreign publications expressing his increasing concern, quote, with news accounts that portray this administration as planning to wage protracted nuclear war, unquote. His, quote-unquote, correction of inaccuracies, however, left intact the central issue that both the United States and the USSR no longer consider a prolonged nuclear war to be out of the question, and both sides are preparing for that eventuality. The old concept of a swift knockout by a first strike has given way to the belief that a nuclear conflict could last 6 months or more. Weinberger blamed the Soviet Union for the new attitudes. The Soviets, he said, quote, appear to be building forces for a protracted, that is nuclear, conflict, unquote, and therefore the United States has no alternative but to, quote-unquote, keep pace. None of this was good news for the average citizen in the United States, the Soviet Union, or anywhere else in the world. Carefully planned insanity. The Soviets have been planning civil defense for decades, building underground shelters to withstand nuclear blasts, and also equipping and stocking them. In the United States, virtually nothing has been done to protect the civilian population in the event of war. This failure cannot be blamed entirely on our leaders, but is in large part the result of public apathy based upon two ideas that have dominated American thinking on this subject. Number one, somehow nuclear war will be avoided. And two, if not, then everything would be over quickly under the force of a devastating first strike. So why fret, plan, and spend for something that won't work anyway? For decades, our policy was to have enough survivable retaliatory warheads so that the damage we could inflict upon the Soviets would deter them from attacking us. This has all apparently changed within the past 2 years. Both sides have apparently adopted the insane delusion of quote-unquote limited nuclear war that would extend possibly for months. It takes no genius to recognize the inherent and irresistible temptation for the momentary loser in a quote-unquote limited nuclear war to escalate the nuclear involvement, thereby forcing his opponent to escalate, which would almost inevitably result in a full-scale nuclear war and the unimaginable Holocaust that would produce. Nevertheless, the Reagan administration seems to be proceeding on this course. Many observers feel that the idea of quote-unquote limited nuclear war that may last for months and which one side can eventually win is not only insane, but the most dangerous brand of insanity. Faith in this delusion could encourage one side or the other to start what it imagines will be limited and thereby begin an unstoppable chain reaction leading to the very Holocaust we all dread and want to prevent. Plans for the civilian population seem no less insane than those being made for the military. Having neglected civil defense worthy of the name, it is now almost too late to start. Moreover, the public still lacks either the will or the understanding to support the monumental construction project that would be required to build shelters. According to Tom Longstreth, a civil defense specialist for Defense Information, a Washington, D.C. think tank, the federal government plans to spend about $10 billion on civil defense over the next 5 years, including the eventual construction of fallout shelters. That sum, of course, would hardly start construction. The major portion of the government's belated plans calls for dispersal of the civilian population away from targeted areas. This is so clearly not feasible that the entire quote-unquote crisis relocation program seems like some surrealistic planned insanity. The edge of the cliff. Soviet-American relations are currently at their lowest point since the days of the Cold War, in spite of President Reagan's recent offer to sell more grain to Russia and the continuation of the Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, START, in Geneva after the mid-August break. Plagued by severe economic problems at home and political troubles among its satellites, the Soviet Union was probably marking time under the direction of an interim committee while Brezhnev was chronically ill in the months before his demise. However, Yuri V. Andropov has emerged as Brezhnev's successor with apparent full control established in days instead of the years it has taken in the past for a change in Soviet leadership. This could mean that power is passing to a new group of leaders without the usual months and years of instability and jockeying for positions that creates uncertainty in foreign relations. The Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, START, are proceeding in Geneva, another good sign. The Soviet military machine is generally believed to have at its disposal deadly laser weapons that are years ahead of U.S. developments. Quote, "The consensus in Washington is that the Soviets have already deployed the world's first operational ground-based beam weapon and that they are going all out to deploy space-based beam weapons. U.S. scientists long poo-pooed the idea that such weapons were even possible, while the USSR was busily using U.S. technology to solve those quote-unquote insoluble technical problems of guiding beam weapons," unquote. U.S. intelligence only recently learned of, quote, "a new Soviet missile system that is zeroed in on American cities involving 3 mobile missile regiments equipped with 36 nuclear-tipped SS-16 solid propellant missiles with multiple warheads, that is, MIRV, an 8,000-mile range designed to be fired at U.S. cities in 3 waves across the polar ice cap, from mobile launchers in remote frigid areas near the city of Perm, where military analysts have conceded that it would be quite easy for the Soviets to deploy the weapon in secret," unquote. The threat of nuclear war has been greatly increased by the superpowers' selling of advanced arms to the entire world. International arms sales have increased, quote, "from $100 billion in 1960 to $500 billion in 1980, 15 times higher than worldwide economic aid," unquote. With the new high-technology weapons that are being amassed around the world, even small nations now have the capability of inflicting heavy losses upon the superpowers. The United States, USSR, China, Britain, and France are producing nuclear weapons. It is likely that India, South Africa, and Israel also have developed atomic arms. Within a few years, probably, quote, "an additional 20 to 25 nations will have the capability to produce nuclear weapons," unquote. In fact, the necessary materials can be stolen and an atomic bomb manufactured with the know-how of a university graduate in physics. It would only take the right kind of provocation or even confusion to set off a chain of events that could lead to death and destruction on a worldwide scale that is hardly imaginable. Prelude to World War III? Few analysts doubt that when it comes, World War III will begin in the Middle East. The Israelis are more aware of this than anyone else, which makes their recent move into Lebanon seem all the more courageous. They acted to save Lebanon from total destruction and remove the PLO in order to end their persistent and intolerable terrorist attacks upon Israeli civilians. Only political pressure from the United States prevented Israel from acting sooner. Created by Egyptian President Nasser in 1964 and headed by Yasser Arafat since 1968, the PLO was driven out of Jordan by King Hussein's Bedouin army in 1970 after it tried to take over that country. Fleeing to Lebanon, the PLO set up its headquarters in Beirut. Beginning in 1975, it seized territory and turned schools, churches, and apartments into armed fortresses. It accosted, raped, dismembered, and savagely terrorized Lebanese citizens. At least 100,000 quote-unquote Christian Lebanese were brutally slaughtered, 300,000 wounded, and 500,000 forced to flee their homes as the PLO, later aided by the Syrian army, expanded its military empire and turned Lebanon, once known as the Switzerland of the Mediterranean, into a perpetual war zone. Under Soviet direction, the PLO camps in Lebanon became the training and operational center of international terrorism. This included all of the major terrorist groups, from the left-wing Baader-Meinhof gang of Germany to the radical left-wing Red Brigade of Italy. Through the PLO in Lebanon, all of these international terrorist groups were financed, equipped, and goaded on by the Soviet Union. The PLO brazenly went about its terrorism against Israel and the world, apparently certain that Israel would never invade Lebanon to destroy its operations for fear of retaliation by the surrounding Arab nations, particularly the Syrians, whose army had taken control of much of Lebanon in order to quote-unquote keep the peace. Secure in this belief, on June 6, 1982, PLO terrorists attempted to assassinate the Israeli ambassador to Great Britain. Israel reacted instantly with air attacks against the PLO terrorists' training camps in southern Lebanon. Taunting Israel from its sanctuary behind Lebanon's borders, as though daring the Israeli army to invade and thereby justify Soviet and Syrian intervention, the PLO bombarded northern Israel with about 7,000 rounds of Soviet-supplied heavy shells and rockets. This was the final straw. Israeli forces struck swiftly. With lightning thrusts, they cut off and surrounded the PLO, preventing escape to the north. Hesitant to engage the Israelis on the ground, in spite of their overwhelming numerical advantage in men and weapons, the Syrians decided to teach Israel a lesson in the air. In one of the largest and fiercest air battles in history, Syria put 200 MiGs into the sky to stop the Israelis, and about 130 Israeli planes engaged them. The result must have staggered and even frightened Syria's Soviet mentors and left them in a state of shock. 92 Soviet MiGs were shot out of the sky, killing 60 to 70% of Syria's best pilots, while not one Israeli plane was downed in dogfights. One was lost to ground fire. A major purpose in Syria's occupation of Lebanon was to extend the Arab encirclement of Israel, tightening the noose. Part of that process was the deployment of 23 of the latest Soviet surface-to-air, or SAM, missile batteries east of Beirut. Israel's Prime Minister Reagan had warned the Syrians to remove them or they would be destroyed. This had seemed like an empty threat. The SAM batteries were virtually unassailable, for any plane coming within range would be shot down. However, to the astonishment not only of the Syrians and Soviets, but American military experts as well, in one of the most spectacular accomplishments in modern warfare, the Israelis suddenly wiped out every SAM missile battery without losing, quote, a single attacking plane, unquote. This incredible accomplishment, which sent shockwaves through the entire international military establishment, was the result of, quote, an original Israeli invention, unquote. There are rumors that Israel has so many other equally miraculous inventions up its military sleeve that its armed forces are confident they could defeat the Soviet Union if it ever attacks Israel, which they believe is inevitable. Israel's lightning conquest of the PLO led to a most disturbing discovery: undeniable evidence that the Soviets have been seriously preparing to launch an all-out invasion of Israel. Even Israeli intelligence was shocked by the huge quantities of Soviet weapons held by the PLO in southern Lebanon that were obviously not for their own use. Hidden away in basements, warehouses, and huge underground storehouses in PLO-controlled areas were enough modern Soviet arms to fully equip an estimated army of about 250,000 men. Obviously, this weaponry was intended for Soviet troops to be brought into Lebanon secretly for a planned invasion of Israel. The Kremlin has apparently decided that the Arabs, after repeated failures, will never be able to destroy Israel, and therefore she must do it herself. Unless some quote-unquote miracle changes the present course of world events, it is only a matter of time until the Soviet Union finds what it will then declare to be, quote, unacceptable provocation, unquote, justifying its planned attack upon Israel. This will most certainly involve the United States and NATO. That World War III will then develop into a full-scale nuclear holocaust seems almost inevitable, again, barring some quote-unquote miracle. Is World War III Armageddon? The Bible speaks of a frightful battle called Armageddon, which will take place in Israel and result in the utter destruction of the armies of the world. Some Christians believe that World War III will occur 3.5 to 7 years earlier than this, and that it will arise out of a Soviet attack upon Israel, which will result in the almost total destruction of the armed forces of Russia and her satellites and allies. Why do they feel that World War III is separate from and must come before Armageddon? Because they can conceive of nothing except a greatly destructive war to prepare the world to accept the Antichrist as its ruler. Obviously, Armageddon is too late for this, so there must be a great war before it. According to this view, it is the destruction of the Soviet bloc's forces that leaves Western Europe as the greatest surviving power in the world, making it possible for a charismatic leader within this 10-nation confederacy, the Antichrist, to seize control and rule the world. The Antichrist's ascension to power is supposed to usher in a period of worldwide peace, which will later be shattered as God's judgment is poured out upon this earth during that period called the Great Tribulation. Finally, Armageddon follows as the nations of the world, now recovered from World War III, all converge in this great battle in the Middle East. Just as it seems that Israel will be destroyed, Christ returns from heaven to rescue her and set up his kingdom with headquarters at Jerusalem. Our contrary scenario is considerably different. With all due respect to the opinions of others, there seem to be many reasons why this interpretation outlined above doesn't fit the biblical prophecies. Ezekiel 38 verse 11 and 14 states clearly that the invasion will come during a time of peace, when Israel feels extremely secure and is not expecting any attack from anyone. This isn't even plausible as long as the Soviet Union and Arab nations continue to menace Israel. Clearly, worldwide peace must be established before the Soviet attack upon Israel. This will only come about after the Antichrist takes control of the world. Therefore, the USSR's invasion of Israel and its total defeat by Israel and Western Europe can hardly be the means by which the Antichrist comes to power. In fact, there is no indication in the Bible that Israel and Western Europe allied together will defeat the Soviets and their allies. This will only be effected by the direct and miraculous intervention of Israel's Messiah. Furthermore, this popularly accepted interpretation requires 2 attacks upon Israel and 2 great destructive battles in the Middle East. It seems clear, however, that there will be only one event fitting this description. Ezekiel 38 and 39, Zechariah chapter 12, and Revelation 16 verses 13 through 16 and 19 verses 11 through 21 seem to be referring to one great battle on the soil of Israel, not to 2. There are other difficulties with this popular view. First, it requires a period of quote-unquote peace and prosperity between World War III and Armageddon, but the length of time available, from 3.5 to 7 years, hardly seems adequate. And second, it leaves out China. Why wouldn't China move swiftly into Russia and take control there if the Soviet armed forces have been virtually destroyed and the Western allies, though victorious, are themselves greatly weakened by the losses they have suffered? Contrary scenario, with a strange twist. If we are to meet all of the criteria set forth in the biblical prophecies, then not only Russia, but also China must be neutralized. Moreover, this must happen before the eventual Soviet attack upon Israel. There will only be one attack which will involve all the armies of the world, including those of China. World War III and Armageddon are one and the same event. The Antichrist will have already taken control of the world before this time. Israel and all the world will feel secure in a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity, a new age that many people will mistake for the millennium promised in the Bible. We are left then with the necessity of finding an explanation for the Antichrist's ascension to power other than World War III. How does he gain the allegiance of the entire world, including the Soviet Union, China, other communist countries, and even the Arabs? The scriptures don't spell this all out in detail, but there are enough hints to give us a fairly good idea of what is going to happen. As we look into this, we will see that events in the world today are accelerating swiftly in this very direction. Our contrary scenario has a strange twist in it, yet it is so obvious that it seems amazing that it hasn't been recognized by everyone. The Antichrist will undoubtedly step into the vacuum caused by a catastrophic event that will dramatically shift the balance of world power. However, it will not come about through the destruction of the USSR, but through the sudden and mysterious elimination of the USA as a world power.